Okay, so we are.
Yes, you do.
All right. So welcome everyone. Since we have formatted our meetings in this under this label as open meetings, I suppose we should not be doing introductions each time we meet, and make it just simply open with open door, and whoever comes and listens comes, and once the discussion starts and we are speaking, then people like are free to introduce themselves or you know, like let's make it into this kind of like an open academic space with open doors. So without introductions of each and everyone, let me just say that we are in a next, and actually like getting more and more open and official, so maybe an introduction is actually needed. A seminar which is co-organized by CLEA Research Center at the Free University of Brussels and Buckminster College in Bruges, in cooperation as a joint research group. And today's topic that we'll be discussing, we have 2 hours for that, is it's a very silly question, like what is it all for? Like, occasionally maybe revisiting this question can be useful. We'll see, you know, like what we'll do with it today. We have 4 speakers, each for 20 minutes. We'll start with Sayfan Borghini. One day you'll teach me what how to sound well here, for 20 minutes. Then Marta 20 minutes. Then Gerard Zeeuw. And in the program that you got by email, I was listed in this time slot, but Gerard has agreed to take this spot. I'm very grateful for this. And my seminar is scheduled for January anyhow, so I think it will be very beneficial to hear from Gerard today. And the last one, who is not yet joined, he's maybe look occasionally if we are not keeping people waiting in the. Oh, Harry is, and now I see I can also be.
I made you host.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Cool. Okay. So the 4th speaker of the day will be Weaver, who hasn't still joined us, and after that we'll have 40 minutes for comments, questions, discussions, all sorts of interactions. So not to postpone anymore, I suppose let's invite Sayfan and let's dive in to the purpose of the strange activity that humans sometimes do.
Okay, but you need to allow me to share screen.
Yes, now it should be possible.
Okay, yes, it is. Okay, occasion. There we go. Okay. So, okay. Of course, this is an opener for discussion. It's not. I first found myself confronting this question about 10 years ago, when I was much less involved in education, and I looked at it as a provocative question. But then the years passed, and the more I look at it, and the more I think that actually it's a critical question, it's a necessary question. It's really important to re-ask it, because I will say one. So I will look at 2 main aspects within the question. Very simply, how did we arrive to the current form of education and the idea of education? This will be very, very fast. And the second aspect, which is into which future we are educating. Can we consider it a continuity, or should we look at it as a discontinuity? Now, concerning the idea of formal education, first of all, it is one of the oldest traditions, funnily enough. Of course, it was related to a very small percentage, but there are records from the very beginning of writing language from the Middle East. And since then, there is plenty of different kind of traditions where education has evolved differently, but always in correlation with abstract thinking or the development of new technologies that needed learning. So it's writing, it's social technologies, religion, moral, coordinated production, administration. In the beginning, it's mostly based on the texts that were there, which were either religious or administration, and they served a need for social function, but also, of course, distinction of social caste and role, complying with the authority, and employing different types of discipline. Now, when we come to the last century, it's important to note that actually in less than 1 century, education moved from something that was about 2% of the world population to today, which is in 2020 around 90% of the world population primary education, 60% secondary, 40% tertiary, which means that along 1 year, we educate more people than in all of human history, which is an interesting level of impact. So now the question that I'm going a bit free on this, and are we looking at a product of history or are we looking at a product of insight? So of course there have been plenty of studies that already identified all kinds of agendas within this expansion and big jump of systemic education. Among them, the need to standardize for maintaining empires or nations, or to provide for factory working condition. So it was a lot about order, obedience, reliability. It was based upon discipline, but we also know that if it is something that it lasted that long across human history, there is probably some very relevant advantages to it, which mean it does make a significant difference. And I would rather say, this is at least the way I look at it, that education is the human first enhancer. By that I mean that it's actually what connects us or what gives us access into the huge cultural potential for evolution that our species, our society has, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And also studies that are being done in the last decade are showing that actually education produces even some neural structure transitions, which are interesting. So now the question that I'm left with is how to tease out the difference between the historical that comes with all kinds of agenda that might be extremely not relevant, together with aspects that have to do with enhancing human condition and cognition and intelligence. So, for example, this is just to briefly mention some of the paradoxes that we have. So are we educating an individual, functional member of society? Are we speaking about collaborative intelligence or going with the herd? Is learning reflective challenge, or is the cause for lost interest? Are we in touch with creativity? Are we following instruction? And so on. There are many, So I did a I began with building a distinction for me to try and answer this question. What you see here is 4 different aspects. There is the I, which here I'm looking at it as a living organism. And in a way, this drawing, it's inspired by the work of Maturana. It looks like the autopoietic cognitive look of the living organism. So there is a living organism, an I, which interacts with the world. While interacting with the world, it influences it, and at the same time, it gains insight about the world and about itself. And so I have here 4 aspects that I kind of artificially distinguish between them: the self, the world, insight, and influence. But once I have them like this, I can also say that they are kind of interacting between them. And so I have this aspect of interaction between the self and the world, between the insight and influence, which I can also relate to the aspect of gain, which is what I understood my conversation with Sasha, that is actually what is going on as the first role of the Bachmann system, which is very interesting. So in which fashion the game of interaction between the self and the world co-define both of them, or allows to co-discover both of them, and in which fashion the interaction and game between gaining understanding and gaining influence is interacting there. Now, it can be, of course, at the level of the physical, of the abstract, of the reflective. It's just as if more layers are added to this. I will come back to it in the end in a more defined fashion. So the graph that we just saw, I said it's being inspired by Maturana, and another aspect of the theory of autopoiesis is defining living as a process of cognition, which means that we need to do nothing in order for it to be a process of cognition, by the simple fact that living in the world is the way that we create it moment by moment. And this, in the way that I understand it as of today, implies also that by the simple fact that we are living in the world, we continuously modify, and we modify all of the environments in which we live. So for a moment, it might be relevant, specifically when we ask this question of education, what for, to kind of take a step back and to reapprehend what is the habitat in which we exist. And is there a difference? I look at it across my life, but of course, I'm inviting everybody, and it's a much wider question and reflection upon it. So I think the comic is self-explanatory. Yes, we have modified the physical environment to a level and to an exponential fashion which has no precedent in our history. And the same goes for the social technological in which we exist, as well as the knowledge ecosystem, the level to which we are connected in a global set of networks, and of course the personal environments which are growing with technology, with science, with increasing design and production. By the way, this year I just found out it's the first time that the built environment, so everything which is built and produced, is overtaking in amounts, in mass, all of the organic material on the Earth. Of course, these are guesses, but they are very well computed guesses. So we are at a very critical kind of threshold. It's a world profoundly different from the one we grew up in terms of population, in terms of life expectancy. Along my life, population doubled twice, which is almost, it was surprising to look at it. Life expectancy doubled in the last century. The level of urbanization, of course, all the rest, climate change. But most importantly, I think that education, the way that I went through it, it was kind of world. And as of today, we are in a very different situation. The material limitation, the planetary boundaries, which were first raised in the 70s, but nobody really expounded long enough on it, as of today are part of the state of affairs. So we have this graph of exponential change, which can be applied to many different dimensions of our life, and for sure will be applied to everything which is from here on. So I'm giving now an example. I am teaching a course on sense making to university undergraduates, and along the course I decided to put the class into an experiment. Let's try and make sense of let's make a research and find leverage point for what concerns fake news, which is something that in a way is rather recent phenomenon. Of course, conspiracy exists in our history for many. And when we start to look at it, yes, of course, there is the internet infrastructure, there is the fact that smartphones are correlated to it, there is the WhatsApp small groups, which are a big part of pushing it on, and then in some fashion there is how all of this is changing the way we communicate with each other. And then, you know, it begins with the decentralization of communication with the internet, but at the end of the day, we find out that there is a very strong centralization, which is brought on by the business, by the ads, by the big corporates that are now running the tools with which we navigate the internet. And of course, the entry of the algorithms and the way that we do not really understand how they modify how they manipulate for it, our attention. And this is bringing us, of course, to the fact that it impinges upon times in which trust is a bit being eroded in politics and globally, and then you have radicalization. And so we started with something which was, you know, conspiracy about celebrities, but we end up with something which is strongly real and has a very realistic impact upon the world. Now, this is a very complex kind of environment to navigate, and I am working with the undergraduates. They're not children, while everybody that is a teen as of today, it's actually swimming within this. And what we're seeing here, it's just, I'm showing it very shortly. One of the students was doing some kind of analysis of how she fell for one of the fake news. And the interesting point was that at a certain point, she started to do decision according to basic common sense. But then she asked herself, okay, but what is common sense within this environment? Because it's not the same common sense that we use in the social. So this only to say that when we come to reapprehending our habitat, I think we really need to consider that we exist in a completely new habitat. And in a way, it's a good exercise to look at it as a completely new world that we need to learn how to navigate. We need to understand how to deal with its uncertainty. We might have to redefine what is truth, what is not, what is that we want to call truth. And another aspect, which is really interesting within the current state of affairs, is this need to circulate one voice, which I don't think was part of previous generations. If you are upon a social media, you have this need all the time to circulate a voice. And so even this might be, if I go back to this simple example, not so simple example of fake news, part of the engines that allow someone to just click and forward. So if we are speaking of a new habitat, then the next question is, okay, so what is the kind of intelligence that we need? Because we are speaking a lot of intelligence when it's spoken about cognition, when it's spoken about education, but intelligence has been defined for a particular kind of world. And if we are looking at a different kind of world, we should reconsider also these concepts and understand what does it mean to compute decision within this kind of wide systems, what are the relevant configurations in which we can sustain this kind of intelligence, and how can we, make it accessible. So, of course, we have 20 minutes. I'm not into answering this. This is a very short diversion, which is, we all know, I think, in this forum, what is self-organization. But to give this kind of input that intelligence itself can be understood as a self-organizing phenomenon, meaning a self-organizing quality that we cannot fully define, but it's strongly determined by what does it interact, what are the changes in the environment that are triggering the system to reorganize itself. And what is the kind, and this usually happens when there is a threshold of degree of complexity that push the system to reorganize itself, to kind of find its next dynamic equilibrium where it can sustain. So this is an example from also, it's about 10 years ago, but I find it enchanting. I don't know if you know this story, but it's Sugata Mitra. He is a computer programmer that was working in India. He was the very expensive quarter, but they were confining on one of the walls with the slums. So he decided to open a hole in the wall and to place there a computer and just to leave it there open and accessible. And they run this study by now in a number of developing nations and for many years. And they have noticed that actually, without saying absolutely anything, just leaving there the computer, the mouse, the keyboard, children come, they are very interested, they start to interact with each other, they teach each other English, they learn things which are so-called extremely complex for them, but after a month or two, they're actually already a mini school teaching from the one that learn to the one that are not yet learning what does English means and how to play and how to come to the video games. And they repeated this experiment also by giving them to learn very difficult biological kind of knowledge, and they always get to the same result of how the children somehow manage to organize both a group, a type of interaction, and a very fast kind of learning that brings them to very impressive results, very short. So first of all, I think it's an interesting point of reflection. Again, I am not advocating for going with the hole in the wall, but there is something else that emerged from it. I don't know if it's directly correlated. Back then, when Sugata Mitra was presenting their experiment, they also provided a small guide of how to apply it in school. And I found myself in one school and I applied it, and it was actually very interesting. And the principle of it is to come to the children with some kind of phrase, which is very attractive, but also very mysterious, and to ask them to go and to search what does it mean and why it means this, and to bring the whole theory behind. And in elementary school, it actually brings a very interesting result. At least this was my experiment back then, of course, a very local one. But as of today, you have what is called the learning pit, which is indeed presenting the students with some kind of question to which they do not know the answer, and letting them work it out. I don't really think it looks the way it looks here, because this is very individual, and I think that the process, the way it works, demands a class and demands the confusion, demands the discussion, the presentation. But there is this idea of managing to engage someone with something that is important enough to trigger the process of learning, which is very different from just teaching it. This is also, I think we're around. Marta, how long do I have?
Yes, it's past time already. So.
Okay, so I will jump this, if it allow me. Okay, so these are the few things with which I re-emerged on the other side. What ignites engagement is something which I hear a lot everywhere. How to recalibrate this relation, intelligence, individual, collective, how to use the group, how to use the class. And also the need to reconsider the role of top-down and bottom-up processes in the organization of knowledge, because yes, of course, the internet brought us fake news, but it also brings us fantastic endeavors, Wikipedia, Linux, open source. So there is this aspect of how the top-down and the bottom-up need to find a way. Now, a few lines that I took, if I call the question, okay, so it's a new habitat, so now are we going to navigate it? There is where to take. This is taken from one, it's Education for the Future, 1999. He gives 7 main lines. They are a bit, so it has to do with detecting error in the approach to knowledge. So this ability to understand that knowledge is never perfect, it's never absolute truth. Pertinence of knowledge, knowing the human condition, one should be introduced to it. The planetary era, which this is very different, the awareness to planetary limits and the legacy of the last century, understanding each other, confronting uncertainties, and the democratic dialogue. So this I am just mentioning because I think not necessarily it's about teaching it, but it carries a number of attitudes which can be interesting while thinking about it. And this is just to close with this. If I play again, and this again, I'm putting here just as a discussion sketch. It's nothing more than this. But let's say that I go with the aspect of the self and the way it interacts. I would like to see there, yes, of course, the persona, the embodied, the individual, but also the human. If the human, then the humanity. And I think that we need to introduce here life, in the sense that I am a live organism, so it goes all the way from me to life at large. And then when I go to the world with which I interact and I learn from, so of course the other, but then all the environment, so the habitat, the context, and we have to somehow give space to everything that has changed and will continue to change, because whoever will learn needs to build this thing to keep on learning on a continuity, because it's not about learning a fixed map, and it's not about learning a given word. We are within something that is in change. And then influence, it's all about agency. So to introduce this kind of improving mindset, making it meaningful by myself, applicabilities of my abilities, and of course, the pleasure of gaining understanding of abstraction, self-learning, respect, and wonder, knowledge production. Okay, that's, I think, the rush through the opening of the question.
Excellent. Thank you, Sayfan. Thanks. Marta.
I'll do stop sharing.
Yeah.
If I manage. Stop sharing. Here it is. Marta, we cannot hear.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just trying to figure out my technology on the screen. And Sayfan, I'm looking forward to our conversation at the end. There's a number of points where you'll see we'll come into conversation with each other.
Gladly.
So I'm new to the crowd, so I thought I would introduce myself. Starting out, I'm Marta Shaw. I have worked with Marta Lenartowicz before. I work at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. But I also want to, as I start, to bring you into a different corner of my world. I think you can all picture what it's like to work at a university. I'm also involved with a community called SLOT, which organizes the largest alternative art festival in Poland, which is one of the educational contexts that have shaped me. So as a self-disclosure of who you're going to have to do with, this is a little picture of SLOT. It happens in the grounds of the largest monastic complex in Poland, near Wrocław. You're all invited to come, and I just want to show you a brief snippet. Marta Lenartowicz has been there and has spoken there. So here's just a little picture of what it looks like. Just a couple days a year, a gigantic monastery turns into SLOT, a little town bursting with life, with 150 workshops, 100 concerts, meetings, rooms, and cafes. Create with us what is common. So the snippet's a little old, but it's still happening despite COVID. And it's a good metaphor for a couple of the things that I'll be talking about. So as I think about the goal of education, or what education is for, this quote comes to mind by Aldous Huxley, whom I didn't know as a philosopher until very recently. And he wrote a brilliant little book called Ends and Means. And he says this about the goal of human effort. And as we ask about the goal of education, the goal of human effort is a good place to begin. And he says the ideal goal of human effort has been the subject of a good deal of agreement, which surprised me when I first read this. He says, from Isaiah to Karl Marx, the prophets have spoken with one voice. In the golden age to which they look forward, there will be liberty, peace, justice, and brotherly love. Not so with regard to the roads which lead to that goal. right? Here, unanimity and certainty give place to utter confusion, to the clash of contradictory opinions. We defend them dogmatically with the violence of fanaticism. So I love that quote, and I like it as a place to begin thinking about what education's for. It's about a path to this place we all want to get to, right? Where the world is a better place, where there's peace, justice, liberty, brotherly love. So how do we get there? I have 2 young children who are watching cartoons right now as I do this. Here's a picture of them in a rare moment when, other than when watching cartoons, they're not fighting with each other. And it's been quite amazing to me as a mom of 2 little ones, how much work it takes to get children to not be violent to each other. One will take the other's toy. They're 3 and 4, both boys. There's a long way to go for them before we manage to teach them that hitting each other is not an okay response when someone takes something you want, right? And we've traveled around the world. We lived in 2 different countries, and in the places where we've lived and where we've been, it is common practice for parents and others in society to tell children not to hit each other. That seems to be one of the things that we've agreed on as a means to getting to the sort of world we want. We don't want a world where people solve conflict through violence, right? And we've come a long way, and Harari shows this quite well in his books. We don't die of violence anymore, partly because we've agreed on this very thing. And with that, I need to say a couple of things that will be obvious, but I will say them anyway. I'm a linguist by my first training. I was a linguist in my past life, and it's an obvious obviosity, but we think in metaphors, right? I learned in my training as a linguist that metaphors are not these optional figures of speech, and all thinking is fundamentally metaphorical. There's this quote I really like by C.S. Lewis that gets at that. Metaphors are not just these optional tools for poets, right? Not just words or images that help us describe some sort of a concept that exists in the mind. This metaphorical connection is how our brains understand anything. Anything new that we understand by means of connecting it to what we already know, comparing it to something we already know. So I think you all know a lot more about this than I do at this point. But kind of the introductory thesis here is that, especially when it comes to these deepest metaphors, what Johnson and Lakoff call ontological metaphors, they're not optional, they're a kind of sense, right? They're like seeing, they're like hearing. And especially when we speak and think about things we can't see, like our own mind, we have to speak and we have to think as if we could see them, right? So the economy grows, we say, like trees and flowers grow, or an institution grows, right? Or we say that energy is released as if it were an animal set free from a cage. Thus, like C.S. Lewis says, that books on psychology or economics are as metaphorical as books of poetry and devotion. So my thesis today that I'd like to discuss with you is that we seem to understand our own minds by reference to our technology, and the metaphors that we use to describe our own minds, the metaphors that organize the way that we think and talk about our minds, have some implicit assumptions about them that affect the way that we do education. And it's an interesting question for me where we are when it comes to that today. So here's a picture of a couple of elephants. Back in the day, the most advanced technology people had were the animals that they domesticated. So there's this quote by the Buddha, right, who compared the mind to this wild elephant who needs to be controlled by the trainer, right? So it's this picture of a wild animal where the goal of education, if we understand the mind as a wild animal, is to train the trainer, right? To give the trainer more control over the animal, if this is how we look at it, right? The other example I have up here is also from the world of wild animals. It's from Plato. In Plato's Phaedrus, we have this image of the mind as a chariot drawn by two horses. So there's the white horse, right, which is the good horse, and there's the black horse, and then there's the charioteer. And the goal of education, again, is to help the charioteer gain control over these two horses. And I think I have a quote up here from Plato too. The horse on the right is on the nobler side, is upright in flame and well jointed. I like this one about the high neck and the regal nose. He's a lover of honor, with modesty and self-control, companion to true glory. He needs no whip, is guided by verbal commands alone. And this other horse is maybe more like Buddha's elephant, right? This great jumble of limbs, companion to wild boasts of indecency. He's shaggy around the ears and deaf as a post, barely yields to horsewhip and goad combined, right? So a different picture of the mind, which has its implications for how we do education then, right? There is a good horse that we have to work with, but there's also the bad one. And education's about equipping the rider with the sorts of tools that the rider needs in order to control these two horses. So the implied purpose of education, as long as our most advanced technology was the animals we've domesticated, animals which are part of the biological world, in both of these cases, animals that are larger than ourselves, right, is to gain control of the inner animal, which has more strength. It's larger than me, but I'm more intelligent than the animal. So education is about giving me the sorts of tools, the knowledge I need, but also the kind of inner strength of character that I need to control the inner animal. Now, of course, all of this changed with Freud. Freud is the one who kind of brought to our attention just how difficult it is, just how impossible it is perhaps to not just control the inner animal, but to even be aware of the inner animal. And I like this quote from Jonathan Haidt, a great book called Happiness from the Ancients till the Modern Day, or something to that effect. I read it in Polish. And he says when he lectures on Freud, he thinks of the mind in Freud's thinking as a horse and buggy, kind of a Victorian version of the chariot, where there's not just the driver struggling to control this disobedient horse, which is a familiar trope here, right, from the earlier metaphors, but we also have the driver's father who's sitting in the back seat, kind of lecturing the driver on what to do and what he's doing wrong. And the implied purpose of education here, with this metaphor, would be strengthening the charioteer, so that the charioteer is not only controlling the horse, but also gaining a level of independence from the backseat driving father of the superego, right? So that's Freud. There's also the religious aims of education and religious metaphors. My children are in a Catholic Montessori preschool, which is a very interesting, as of 2 weeks ago. So it's an interesting other world to explore there. But where I'd like to go today is what happened with the Enlightenment, which Sayfan, you also referred to, with this striving for order, obedience, reliability. This is the time when the leading technology became the machines that we built. And this is also where we start talking about the mind as a machine. And this is something that's deeply embedded in our languages in the West, right? We have this ontological metaphor. So it's not just in our language, but it's in the very structure of our thinking, that the mind is a thing and the mind is a machine. And Lakoff and Johnson write about that. So an ontological metaphor is a means to understand events or processes or feelings as things, as substances. And we understand our own mind in the West since the Enlightenment as a thing, and not just anything, as a machine. And the metaphors that we use kind of are telling, right? We say, oh, my head's just not working properly today. Or I'm looking at you on the Zoom screen and can say, oh, I can just really see the wheels turning, right? It's something we say, or we say, I just had a brain freeze, or something, some news just broke my brain, right? We think and structure our thinking about our own mind as if it were a machine. And of course, the problematic part of that is our mind is so complex that we'll never understand it. We like machines because we understand them, right? We built them. And this metaphor does give us a way to make sense of our mind, but how do we make sense of it, right? What is it? Was it an imply? What biases does it carry? So, well, it means we think our mind can be on or off. If it's a machine, it's black or white, right? It has a certain level of efficiency. It has an energy source that makes sense to us. It also has a consistent and predictable mechanism of functioning. Those are all implied in this ontological metaphor of a mechanism, our mind as a mechanism. And this has implications. Sayfan, you talked about this crazy rate of growth that we have. It's rooted in notions in economics that draw on this mechanistic metaphor, right? We see the world is in a mechanistic way as a reflection of our minds, but this idea of an economic man, right? The Homo economicus who pursues the subjectively defined ends in a consistently rational way. It's not really a man, it's a machine. And I'm a perfectionist, so you can ask my husband, he's living with the day-to-day implications of what this means, right? And what this metaphor obscures from view. I don't know about you, I often treat myself like a machine and evaluate my day based on how many things I managed to check off the list. And we tend to do that to ourselves, we tend to do that to our world. And if this is really true, if the ontological metaphor that guides our thinking is one of a machine or a watch, then what's the implication? The computer is just a newer type of machine. The implied purpose of education would be to provide information and resources, right? If there's a machine that has inputs and outputs, then what's required is it needs information to act on, it needs resources to act on. Oh, and here come my children. I'll have to take a little break to make sure they're okay. Okay, we're gonna have a little guest joining. This is Daniel. This is who I was talking about. He's gonna be shy. He's a little non-machine, as you can see. If he were a machine, he would be watching a cartoon like his brother. Yeah, and where Daniel differs from a machine is defined really well by Frans de Waal in Mama's Last Hug, which is appropriate given the situation. De Waal talks about how our mind is nothing like a machine. In fact, it's more like a gelatinous soup than a machine. It has billions and billions of connections, incredibly integrated, right? We're at a place in our knowledge of ourselves where we understand just how different we are from a machine. And De Waal says organisms actually have nothing in common with machines. I maybe wouldn't go as far as to say that. He's saying the clock and computer metaphors are completely useless. And they've certainly done a whole lot of harm to ourselves, to biological life on this planet. And in light of that, this quote came to mind from St. Paul that knowledge puffs up while love builds up. So the more important thing I do here is related to this one than all the knowledge I'm transmitting. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Yeah, and this is the picture of the world we live in. Our knowledge has puffed us up. Our greatest threat is our own efficiency in achieving our short-term ends. So the question I'd like to discuss with you in light of where we are today, what is our default metaphor of the mind now? I'm very interested in this group because of the network metaphors that you work with. But then what implications this has for how we think of the purpose of education. And perhaps the most interesting question here for me is, what does our dominant metaphor actually obscure? Every metaphor reveals something, but it also obscures something else. So what is this network metaphor? If this is the one, I'm curious what you will say. What does it actually obscure from view, like the mechanistic ones did in the past? So those are some things I'd be interested in discussing in our time together.
Right, thank you. Yeah, that's even you know, like one question I'm thinking about is like, is it always the leading technology that is a dominant metaphor? I wonder, like, I'm not sure, but maybe. But then, you know, why something you create and not something else would be the metaphor for yourself? It's just like another question. But okay, it's not the discussion time yet. Gerard, now this would be your spot. You need to unmute here. You are muted. We can...
That's a very good suggestion. Originally, I contacted Marta to ask whether there would be any discussion in this meeting, and immediately suggested that I take the floor and tell something. So that actually is a little bit of a paradox, because I wanted to discuss, but now I am in the position to tell you something. So it's a bit difficult to tell you something when so many other people already have told you something. And moreover, most of what we tell seems to converge to the same thing. So there is quite a bit of an overlap. So the only thing I can do actually is to emphasize the package of what I'm talking about, rather than the message. One of the things that to me is quite interesting, I have one slide which I'm now going to show. Now, where is it? Oh, here. This is my slide. I like to start with a sentence from an interview by Luc van Middelaar in the NRC. And the main point here is that it is an interview with Angela Merkel, and the chair asked her about her plans for the future. What story would she tell about herself? I don't have a narrative, the chancellor said. I live in the present more than many other people. The statement, the comment of Luc is a statement to suggest some reflection, but Merkel acts in the present without a wider view. Now, that to me is a very interesting type of statement. I wonder whether it's really the case. So the question is it actually the case that Merkel was living in the present and thereby trapping herself into the present? What I would like to claim as my contribution to the discussion is that precisely the converse is true. What she was saying is actually, I must be able to distinguish, to disentangle myself from the past as it is known. I can't deal with the problems that other people impose on me. I can't take their advice. I can't listen to people who claim that they have hard data. I can't listen to people who say they have education. That means that she's actually saying, I am educated. As you may know, she was a physicist and an expert in quantum mechanics. So she was relatively far advanced and well educated. But still she is saying it is not what education is about. It is what you deny that education is about. So what she is actually saying is, maybe compared to a number of other elements in society, which is, suppose you are in traffic, then traffic doesn't tell you anything about your past. It doesn't tell you what problems you had in the past. It doesn't tell you where you want to go. It actually tells you this is what you have to adhere to as constraints, and the rest is your choice. So a lot of the structures in society do not have to do with knowledge, but with the possibility of using what has been established in society in such a way that you free yourself from that particular type of society. So when I was thinking about education, I thought, well, what is education for? Maybe I have to ask the question, what is education first before I can say what it is for? But then I realized that maybe my guiding light is Angela Merkel, who says actually so many of the situations in society that support us actually have nothing to do with what we know, but what is constraining us such that we have the freedom to do anything we want within the constraints. And so one of the things in psychological research that has come to my attention recently is a difference that was created in the 1970s, where originally Ward Edwards was setting up experiments such that people would participate in the process of the experiment. So they would get a number of different choices, then they would get information about what information would help them make the choice, and in the course of time, in the Bayesian, by the Bayesian rule, they would learn something. But that is not what Kahneman and Tversky did. They gave people situations where they were expected to react to maybe a bet. And then, of course, it turned out that people have very bad ways of reacting to situations. They don't know statistics as a discipline. They can't apply it. They don't realize what the notion of a probability is. And therefore, Kahneman and Tversky came up with, what was it, 7 major defects on people's thinking. But in my view, what has been the case is actually that Kahneman and Tversky have destroyed the understanding that Ward Edwards was bringing. He said everybody is part of a process. In the process, you are constrained. In the process, you are free to step into the future and do whatever you can do within those constraints. So to me, a very important part of that understanding is that in psychology, you shouldn't listen to psychologists. You shouldn't listen to anybody who knows anything. I can also refer to Karl Popper, who identified his open society. And what he was opposed to is especially this notion that history and any other element in history satisfies eternal laws. They don't do that. It is we who are the internal law. So when you would now be asking me, and what is your message to us? The message is, whatever you try to educate, don't believe in it, resist it. That's the way to be educated. And of course, this is a type of message which is extremely difficult to implement, but I can tell you that I've been teaching this now in the university, but some of you know it. I also taught this way when I was teaching 12-year-old girls mathematics. And that's how they became interested in mathematics. I didn't tell them what it is. I didn't tell them what an equation is. But they were challenged to go outside their usual thinking and to take any type of knowledge as a constraint to free yourself from. I think I stayed within my 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Education would be teaching them not to listen to you. Thanks, Gerard.
But I agree with Sayfan and Marta, you know.
Yeah. Nicely coming together. Weaver, now you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. If we were in a basketball game, I could say that Gerard gave me a very nice assist in order to make a point or two. So actually, I would like to follow more or less this direction of thinking, and just to try to point out something about education, starting from a sentence that might sound a bit puzzling at the beginning. I hope that it will become a bit more clear when I'm finished. And the sentence is understanding without knowledge, and education that goes beyond culture. And in some sense, I would like to propose that what I would consider as a challenging future of education is exactly this: is creating understanding which does not depend on knowledge and does not depend on a specific culture. And in order to make it a bit more clear, I would like to follow some of the ideas of Gilbert Simondon, and also a bit less known thinker, whose name is, just a moment, I have to, Igor Tolika. It's a name a bit difficult to spell. And he wrote about Simondon. He made some interpretation about Simondon. And in Simondon's writing, there is a very interesting theory about the relationships between individuals and society. And this kind of relation, Simondon was calling trans-individuation or trans-individual. And this whole idea that I want to speak about of understanding without knowledge speaks exactly about this, about an understanding which is an individuation that brings about knowledge, but is not necessarily based on any specific body of knowledge. And to make it a little bit more concrete, Simondon is speaking about the psychological world about our minds that are a direct continuation within a continuum of the physical and then the vital aspects of our environment, and the psychological world about is actually a process which is continuing both the physical and the vital dimensions of existence. And this psychological world, which we entertain in our minds, each and every one of us, this world is consolidated into a lot of relationships, objects, manners of being, manners of relating, which we call culture. And this is one of the ideas of Simondon, that actually what we call a process of psychologization, this ongoing happening of our mentality, of our mind, of our emotions, our inner subjective worlds, is consolidated, externalized, and objectified as we call culture. And then we can start speaking about the relationships between individuals and culture, and between individuals and society, as two dimensions of two separate or two distinct, not separate, but two distinct, distinct yet interconnected levels of individuation. And following these ideas, what Simondon was proposing, he was proposing two terms, which I find very interesting in this context of education. One of them is it's called inter-individuation, and the second one is called trans-individuation. And what I want to do is just to shortly explain these two and the difference between these two, and how it is connected to the idea of education that is basically decoupled and goes beyond the idea of education as a means to introduce young minds into cultural and social behaviors, patterns, knowledges, etc. And so let me start with the more simple term of inter-individuation or inter-individuals. And maybe I will read I will read you a short quote from Simondon. In inter-individual connection, the individual enters into relations with others through their individuated self, what is called in French moi, and it appears to itself as the sum of social images which issue from a pre-valorization of the self, grasped as a personality through the functional representation made of it by others. Inter-individual connections mark the utilitarian aspect of social relations, qua the simple functional mediations between individuals. It is these connections that the description of psychology and sociology concern themselves with, thereby limiting their perspectives to the constituted individual or social group. And in my words, what are these inter-individual relations means what we understand, what we conventionally understand the relationships between a person, an individual, and culture or cultural object, or the relationships between individual and other individuals in the context, in the wider context of society. And whatever we can consider about inter-individual relationships, the principle that distinguish this kind of relationships is these are always relationships that are made between already individuated entities, whether these individuated entities are persons, social groups, bodies of knowledge, accepted forms of behaviors, rituals, and any other social or cultural object that you can bring to mind. And so what is important here is that if we speak about education in terms of inter-individual relationships and connections, this is the conventional way of what education means is introduce knowledge, introduce patterns, introduce certain relationships, and in this also consolidating something that we call the self and the individual, in a manner of speaking, as already a product that has a character and an identity. And what I want to suggest is what is in the context of the future of the idea or the future of the concept of education is exactly not this. Because what Simondon actually, following Simondon and what Simondon suggests is that underneath this whole body of inter-individual relationships that maintains the structure of society and the objectification of culture as the product of our psychological objective realm or reality, what he suggests is another term which is called the trans-individual. And what he means about the trans-individual is actually the understanding that both individual persons and social groups and cultures are ongoing processes of individuation that exist in a certain relationship, which he calls the trans-individual. So it is like two processes that exist at different scales. One is the cultural scale or the social scale, and one is the individual person scale. And the process of mutual interaction within individuation at both scales, this is what he calls the trans-individual. And the trans-individual process does not take as a point of departure neither selves as consolidated entities, selves or personalities as consolidated entities, and not the social, the cultural structure that is being individuated through the interaction and interconnections of individuals, not necessarily humans, because you can extend it also to machines, to technological objects, to animals, etc. And even if we now consider viruses as a kind of a biological and also cultural object, we can start thinking how it can be applied. So the argument of Simondon is that as long as we maintain inter-individual systems of relationships, we actually block the intelligent process of the trans individual. And there is a fundamental asymmetry between these two processes that they coexist anyway, side by side. But if we focus only on the first one, on the inter-individual kind of process, and neglect the other one, the trans-individual process, what we create is actually, at any age and at any time, we create a culturally inspired human automaton that are cultural, psychological machines with the sole function of maintaining a certain social and cultural order and relationships that are stable. So coming back to the first point about understanding without knowledge or education without culture, I would like to say that a futuristic, and I may even dare to say post-human understanding of education would be one that exposes two minds, young minds as well as adult minds, of the trans individual, which is actually a process of coevolution of individuals into a higher scale processes that actually feed back to us within their processes. So I hope it was not too complex, because I really condensed an extremely difficult idea into a few minutes. But I think it's really critical to start to think in this direction. So
Yes,
I don't know if it's...
if I can a bit simplify and paraphrase, so and go back through the talk so far. So when we have this moment of Angela Merkel speaking about not kind of extending like a consolidated, or as you would say, individuated storyline, and not just being positioned, like kind of as an agent of any storyline, or kind of in this group relations of different sort of influences. This would be her saying that she's not bound by this inter-individuation matrix. Yes. So what she is doing, she's doing what Gerard was painting as this like, okay, so you are in a traffic jam, but this is the constraint, and what you and the motion of trans-individuation would be kind of emergence, would be freedom. What you can do, you have constraints, you have all knowledge available or not available, you can find it, but what is it that is coming kind of through you, in your mind, into reality? Yes. So now going like one step back to what Marta said about those guiding metaphors, then it would not be a network that would be a metaphor we are speaking about. Network would be exactly this interrelations kind of between consolidated individuals. It would be, I don't know if it's technology, it would be kind of like a cosmic reality of emergence of like always something new, out of whatever, it's nothing basically. And so I don't know if any technological metaphor could come to illustrate those like two planes we
do have self-organization.
Yeah, but self-organization understood as emergence, and not this kind of, like small objects interacting with set rules, so that...
No, as emergence.
Yeah. So So I don't know if technology would, like, maybe, I don't know, quantum computers.
There is a term that was, I think that was mentioned a couple of times in the School of Thinking, which is replacing networks with rhizomes that are mathematically speaking, they are closer to what is called hypergraphs, though they also extend beyond the idea of hypergraphs. But they can include different scales of description. And just to make another point, maybe a connection between what I was saying and what Gerard was talking about is, I think it's not like, I would rather think about this traffic or transportation idea. It's not only identifying the constraints and being free within these constraints. I would rather think about it as an interplay between constraints that existed at any given point and the degrees of freedoms. And sometimes we can, by giving up certain degrees of freedom, we can also change the set of constraints which are directing our thinking. For example, if I'm in a traffic jam and I'm within a car, I always have the possibility to get out of the car, just to leave it in the middle of the highway and, I don't know, get down from the street and go by foot. So maybe it's not very logical or agreeable way of thinking about it, but it takes entirely out of the picture of what is going on the highway.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not utilitarian, but you might feel free in a different manner altogether.
Yes. Yes. So this goes back way to the first talk that Sayfan gave and was speaking about those, like, the difference in the habitat, but like to put together the question of the habitat and the question of the metaphor. We always metaphorize. Yes, we always kind of paint the view of reality. Like, it is always the simplification, what will understand our habitat to be like, and to which we'll be relating. And so then, yeah, so this always also enters the kind of the like adds to this question of those metaphors and what is it all about? Like, where are we as this mind, as you draw, Sayfan, with this self and the world, yes, or the inside and the outside. So who would like to comment? Sasha.
Hi. Yeah. So I think, thanks for all the interesting talks, by the way. I think you were all talking about the same thing, like, let's call it the elephant in the room. Marta Shaw talked about elephants and like taming this wild animal. And when we know in India, they tame wild elephants, and in the end, they just put this pin in the ground and a small rope around the neck, and the elephant stays there. But then for all those of you who have seen the movie Water for Elephants, we also have this circus elephant who is constrained with a spin in the ground and she cannot move. But then at one point, the elephant takes the pin by herself because she's so strong, she can just do it. And she puts the pin in another place. So she takes the pin, starts walking around and puts the pin elsewhere. And it's the same with the traffic jam and things. Like you're in traffic, like Weaver said, you step out of the car and you start walking. So my question is, what is the education for? Is it for the elephant to stay in the place we put her to? Or is it for the elephant to learn how the system works, take the pin out and move somewhere else? And then, I don't know if my message, the thing I want to say is clear, but like you have this elephant, you put it in a place, you say, stay here. And then the elephant, in one way or another, I don't know who learned it to her, or she takes the pin out of the ground. She starts walking around and she puts it somewhere else. So she is free within the constraints that are given to her. Should we teach children or anyone else to move with the pin around, or just to stay with the pin and don't move?
Yeah, how I understand what we should be doing in education is to bring your student to the viewpoint you have now, to the one who is asking this question relative to themselves, you know. And so in the sense, like bring the person up to the point in kind of cognitive development where not only they see your question, but they are the ones in charge of making having an answer. Yeah. Which includes like all possibilities, I believe. And
yes, because you could also just take out the pin and run away. But in the movie, the elephant doesn't do that because she likes the circus and she likes all the people. So she wants to stay there, but she can move freely within.
Yeah, and there are also like a lot of, you know, people who like this circus. So, I don't know. So like when we are speaking about freedom being the kind of maximization of freedom being you know, like what you want, then the spectrum of choices that can be made is the broadest one, including, you know, that like liking the circus and staying in it.
Yes, there is
Yeah.
sorry?
Go ahead.
There is another connection that can be made here to what Marta was saying about metaphors. And I think that I read it in this book of James Hillman, that is noting that we usually are using in our thinking process, in our psychologization process, that it is the mind or the subjective mind. We use always chains of associations and metaphors. And what is interesting is when such chain reaches an endpoint where, in this endpoint, the structure or the object that we have in mind is being literalized. It becomes literal. It becomes a kind of indisputable facts of reality. So I believe that what the elephant does, and this connects to Sasha's reflection, is that the elephant understood that the pin in the ground is not the end of the chain. It's not a literal object, but it's only a relationship between herself and the position that she is located in the space of this circus ground. And the elephant just actually made softer the way that this pin as an object is a factual, literal object in the world, or just a component in a chain of relational metaphors. And once this is being realized, freedom is gained. And it is it's a very interesting kind of freedom, because in this freedom not anything goes. Yes, it's not like everything was destroyed and there is a disorder. No, only the nature of relationships that are constructing our reality has been changed, and this move between literal and metaphorical, it has been softened or liquidized or changed, or no matter how you want to call it. And also this is the way that I'm thinking about the play between degrees of freedom and constraints. It's exactly this. The constraints are always these aspects of our reality that we literalize and make like anchors. We make them anchors in our interaction with the environment. But the anchors can be taken and just move from place to place.
Gerard?
There are many different ways of thinking, and what I would like to emphasize is that we all have a different perspective. Or in other words, we are all reframing the same type of situation in different ways. One of the things that I would like to emphasize is that my reference to constraints is a little bit wider than Warren is actually interpreting it. I'm not talking about traffic jams. I'm talking about the rules that make it possible for traffic to actually be ordered anyway. And the same applies to, I didn't mention that, but because it's a much more powerful example, we also live in a society in which we have a legal system. Nearly everything we do is actually constrained by the legal system, but the legal system is not what actually we are concerned about. It is what we can do within the constraints. And so I think in my reframing of the same question, I would like to emphasize the freedom that you have, given that certain types of situations are impossible. But think of all the lawyers who continuously think of new ways of passing the legal system by. And in those terms, I would respond to Sasha. Obviously, I would like the elephant to move the pin about, which is, you know, he controls the type of thing he can do by telling the audience, this is what I'm doing now. But the interesting thing, of course, is that we always seem to be trapped by the constraints and not realize how many constraints actually can be avoided or even made into something else. So, for example, my immediate reaction to the example of the elephant was not what did the elephant do, but what did the trainer do? Did he teach the freedom of doing things to the other elephants? That's where the real question is, I think. What is it that, what is, if you wish, the type of metaphor that you use? And in my view, well, it's the type of metaphor where actually there are no differences between animals or people. So the animal is not the one to be tamed. It's the trainer who has to be tamed, if you wish. So in my view, education is a process that is independent of the abilities of the individual. So it's a very different type of thing. It is not constraints and degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom are the ones that you can control. It's very different. And of course, in terms of Marta, I must admit that I was extremely aware of the fact that I actually used a metaphor as well, which was Angela Merkel. Well, that is also constraining as well, but we can be aware of that. So I think we must not focus on details, but be aware that it is the human that we are talking about, not the technology. It's the technology that we can teach people to use, rather than the technology to use the humans.
Yes, and if I may add to that, I have a question. Do we change, or the human mind and the human brain, is it changing over time, over 2000 years? I think rather little. Of course, the context and the culture, etc., and technology is changing. But if you look at the question, what is education for? Well, for animals, it used to be, I think, by evolution theory, to better survive, or with better chances survive in situations. But now, when also I hear the speakers, we want to express ourselves better with education, or to come to our full potential, that is already far away from the real origin and the real purpose of education, which was surviving. So there's a big distance. I'm reading also this book of Stanislas Dehaene on how we learn. And there he explains that it's also a question of fashion, maybe. Take, for instance, the Steiner school. It was introduced some 10 or 20 years ago. It was non-conformist in a sense, but now it has become more or less back conformist. But in the time, it was really new. But if I read Stanislas Dehaene well, what he says is it's also partly about fashion, because the way we are structured in our head and the way we efficiently learn, for instance, the Steiner school or the classical way of education, they have all the pros and cons. And shouldn't we concentrate and focus in a future way of educating on how our brain is structured? And it is not that flexible. Of course, there's plasticity, etc., but there are also genes, etc. So that is my question. How can education evolve? And are we not forgetting partly that it's just evolution theory?
Sayfan?
Yes. So one of the things that I try to say concerning formal education is that actually when we look at formal education, I don't agree with that it is about survival. I think that it is more a bridge between the fact that as individual organisms, there is a minimal genetic change or physical change. But when we look at us as interacting groups and society and civilization, the level of evolution that has happened at this level, it's huge. And it is a very big and very fast potential. And in principle, I think what education does, it bridges us into this potential, making us good navigators of it, because it is huge. Yes, as of today, it is something immense, but education can give us the power to navigate it and to use it and to edit it and to curate it and to move in between. But this in itself, it's a habitat. Yes, if I go back to what I was opening, and if it is a habitat, we have to understand how to make it something that can be navigated, because I do want the entry to this immense potential, which is the cultural. Yes, the cultural, the ideal, the abstract, the overall abstract realm that has been developed across these 2,000-3,000 years. It's huge. And it makes the whole difference. I don't think that our evolution is really happening on how our brain is wired, but it's very much happening on how our communication interdependence is wired. It's extremely different, and it's extremely potent. And education is a kind of a door to this. And in this sense, I don't think it's necessarily about the technology, but it's about how to become a navigator of this, how to be able to move through it and to make it a habitat rather than to be a product of it. But for this, we need to look at it as a habitat within which we want to learn how to move.
I would agree with that. The only thing I would add is that we can also modify the habitat.
We do all the time. We do, by the simple fact that we live within it. We do.
Teachers modify the habitats.
What? Okay, so maybe I don't understand. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you're in a classroom, it's the teacher who creates the habitat.
Depends. There are all kinds of classrooms. It depends. It's not a given. It's really not a given.
Some teachers do.
But it's like to manage to describe it to a young student as this, world needs to be discovered and navigated, through which you carve your path, through which you find your treasures. And this is the way that you move through it. I think this is what, the presence of the adults are supposed to bring in, this kind of being fashioned and engaged, and sometimes we manage and sometimes less. But then you wish to see someone entering it as a world to be discovered, because this is what it is, if we look at it from this standpoint. And then also the process of individuation that Weaver was mentioning can happen within the navigation within this kind of habitat. Yes, of course, there is all kinds, not necessarily. It's not about finding the specific location, but it's more like taking each time the pole, moving it to a slightly different location in the habitat, doing few tours, then moving it again. And I think it's an open question of how to do this. And I'm not saying there is the answer.
So do we want education focused on complying to the habitat, or do we want it to go beyond that?
No, Sasha, it's not about complying, but it's about, if you see it as something that it's like this unknown world that you are discovering while walking. So you have a certain kind of power of influence, because you do the step, this weird creature responds to you, you understand something, you do another step, and so on and so forth. So it is a kind of trans-individuation, if I use the word that Weaver introduced. It means it's being created on the go. But what you are supposed to earn, if I understand the discussion we're having, what you're supposed to earn is the ability to navigate it. It's like not to be constrained by it and not to have to comply to it, but to earn along the way the ability to navigate it. Because by now we have amounts of knowledge that cannot be contained anywhere. So it's not an issue of becoming a specialist of something, not only at least, but it's what can you do with this amazing thing? It's like, how do you work with it? How do you connect to it? Where do you find your pleasure, your passion, and how also you build the axis for interaction, that it does not stay into particular coordinates. And it's really not simple when it comes to, teenagers.
Yeah, and this is what I yes, Gerard, please.
Well, just to check something, I would agree with Sayfan that one of the ideals of our present society is that people are becoming independent in that sense. What I think we must keep in mind is that any type of formulation is constraining and trapping us into something. So the only thing I would like to do is to add to your formulation the following. Yes, we do have to connect with the things around us, including science and knowledge. But on the other hand, we might also consider science and knowledge the constraints on our freedom.
Yes, I think that this is very accurate, and what I meant at the beginning of my talk about understanding without knowledge is exactly this. It's a certain manner of relating that allows an interplay, that allows an interaction that does not become imprisoned in rigid sets of patterns or relationships, but is able to be in a continuous process of individuation. So it's about the manner or the nature or the style of relationships that exist between objects, between individuals, between selves, etc. And of course, if something is frozen and becomes dogmatic, is exactly because this style of relationships is somehow became itself frozen or limited.
But if you look at it as something that can be navigated, it doesn't really matter, because it may have become dogmatic, but you are the one that moves. So you may stay for a while within particular kind of constraints, but then there is this ability to move. So in this sense, it's like, this is again, to go to the metaphor. It is a metaphor, but it is a metaphor that allows to relate to all the huge fields of knowledge as something that is to walk through, or to work with, or to discover, or to navigate, which is something very new. It couldn't really be done before. It is also a result of the current ecosystem of knowledge, which is very different from what it was. And maybe it should be considered when asking about education. This is not something that was accessible at all 50 years ago.
I would like, again, to put up a little finger, a warning finger. If you say to navigate, that is a way of talking which is extremely constraining in essence. Because, for example, there is an area AI artificial intelligence, and I know how to navigate AI. But I would be seriously concerned if Dirk, for example, would say, you teach me how to do it. No, he has to develop his own way to do it. So navigating is okay, but we must keep in mind that everybody has a different way of navigating.
By all means.
Okay.
Also, what I would like to add to the point of Weaver, I don't know if I have such positive or negative feelings on, for instance, dogmatic learning as such, and a body of knowledge on dogmatic learning. If we learn in Belgium or in the States the traffic rules and how to navigate the car in the traffic, it is dogmatic. Okay, we can helicopter ourselves and say, these are the laws who are governing today in Belgium on the traffic. But we have to learn them dogmatically. I have nothing against this, but I see also that under certain circumstances or for other subjects, this is not the way to go. And we must be more freely and be aware of constraints, etc.
I don't think that is what we are talking about, actually. There is no problem to teach physics as it is, the standard form of physics. But what is a problem if you believe that the standard form of physics is the standard form you have to adhere to? So learning something standard is fine. You know, the table is stable, my table is relatively stable. So it's fine to learn to avoid it in the room. But as soon as you think that it is dogmatically stable.
Yeah. But I come to you. You have to adhere to the traffic laws. Otherwise, you have a problem. That's not the same with physics. Physics, there might be a reality and a truth beyond it, but it's more temporal, and there will be evolution in thinking on physics, etc.
Take the law of gravity. You have to adhere to it. But you can also put wings on you and fly.
Yeah, that's very amusing, because let's have a certain mind experiment. Suppose someone, I don't know where, in Hungary, for example, in a small town, discovers that everything that we thought about gravitation, the Newtonian gravitation and Einsteinian gravitation, is not correct. And this person demonstrates the new idea about gravitation that he has, but being able to levitate wherever, without wings, without any means of propulsion, just levitating in the air. And now let's think how society, science, the institutions will respond or relate to such an extraordinary event, to such an anomaly. What will happen? I believe that more probably than not, this person will find himself in an asylum before becoming the next Nobel laureate. Yeah, just making a point.
Well, there are constraints, even on constraints, as you say. But you have to be aware that any constraint is actually an opening up. So a dove, the bird, has discovered that gravity can be avoided. And then, of course, the dove still has to learn how to avoid the bullet.
We are approaching the end of our time for today. I'm like, one comment I keep having that I wanted to bring in the end, because it's like leading to the next stage that was proposed for how we might proceed in our seminars. I have discovered like it's we won't agree, you know, like we will not agree, but we'll more or less agree. We can kind of, you know, like paint a wonderful picture which sounds good, which is like very freedom oriented, which is like very, you know, like takes into account all sorts of ways we understand reality, but also kind of morally will sound like this white horse that Marta has shown us. Like we want so wonderful things, and liberty, and what else was there for everyone, and it will be all wonderful, yes, and great. And this is like one path, and we, you know, like it's fun to have those conversations. But another way of kind of unpacking all sorts of differences and difficulties and actually thinking together is to try to do something together. And, you know, like put us with just 4, you know, gamers of Buckminster in a house for 5 days and hear us debating what we'll do now and why that. Completely different story, you know, like there is not so much, you know, like white horses running around at all, you know, and because they start, you know, like walking around and saying things, speaking simultaneously everyone, you know, like doing all sorts of things you didn't foresee in your design. Yes, wonderful freedom, but where is the learning? Where is everything? So like the actual situation, you know, classroom situation, in the room situation, in the game, in wherever, brings all sorts of kind of everything at once, yes, all considerations at once, that physics, like, you know, you need to learn it to kind of not accept it, yes, and all sorts of layers to the puzzle. So what I want to propose for the future is that there is one seminar which is scheduled now for January, in which, you know, I'm afraid, but I will try to do it. I want to show you how I am thinking about designing a school, because one recipe that could be like sound very awesome, you bring wonderful people, very knowledgeable, very colorful, very diverse together, you let them, you know, debate and interact and play and design together, and wonderful things happen. Yeah, but there is another layer that organizing stable things kind of requires, is that you bring, like you know, you have budgets, you have time allocations, you have buildings, you have schedules, you have rules or don't have rules, and you have rules about not having rules or having rules. Yes? So all sorts of actual, real stuff from which you glue the thing. And so I would like to start from, like, actually from this, like, from the sort of design that, like, when I'm thinking about managing an organization, I tend to think, okay, like, things will either be well reflected in the budgetary structures or organizational structures, or basically disabled or like largely, you know, made impossible because those structures will be like badly designed or kind of too conventional, or like too not conventional, too rigid, too you know, loose, and so on and so on. So it will be like a, you know, like a kind of like a SimCity or Minecraft, you know, simulation that we put a bunch of you know, fun people to teach. We put a bunch of children of a certain age. We put, you know, budget in, and like to make it pleasant, I will make it big. And then, like, how do we do it? You know, how do we structure curricula? How do we structure the day? How do we structure kind of types of jobs, you know, for people? in the situation. So this will be January, and after that, we could be taking one by one elements which are like most kind of combustive in like potential, you know, like differences that we could pull out in our understandings, to zoom on specifics, you know, like this and this and this and this. We'll see what it will be, combined with like that we come with like having read something like or so this would be more like a workshop or discussions, but like bringing our understandings and ideas to the, you know, like this table that kind of, you know, stands, you know, or tries to stand. And so what do you think about this? Let's try. Okay, so so it's time to finish today. Thank you to the speakers, each of you. Thank you to everyone who's participating and listening. And it's nice that we had a little bit bigger group than before. We were working like in a small team at the beginning, but now we'll be kind of advertising and inviting, and just as I said at the beginning, this one is an open event. So if there is anybody you wish to just, you know, bring along or send the link or invite or post on social media, just feel free to invite people. We'll be meeting them then. So Sasha is writing. Thank you to the speaker. So thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Max.
See you.
Bye.
Hi, Max. How are you?
Oh, wasn't listening that much. Okay. So. Okay, so I'm
Still there. He is still there.
I think he has muted. Okay, so
muted. Probably is on the toilet, but you know.
okay, so I'm closing the
Yes.
app. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye now.